The dust of the street was a living thing, a fine red powder that clung to her like a shroud. It coated the frayed hem of what had once been a wedding dress, now a ragged testament to a journey that had ended here, tied to a hitching post in the center of a town that had no name she knew. Her bare feet were numb against the hard-packed earth, the skin cracked and bruised. She kept her eyes fixed on a single, splintered board in the saloon porch across the way, a focal point to anchor herself against the waves of murmurs that lapped at the edges of her hearing. They had looked at first. The whole town had come out to see the woman Sterling had brought back and then discarded. They saw the wildness in her hair, the gaunt hollows of her cheeks, the way she didn't weep or plead. They saw the coarse rope that chafed her wrists, binding her to the post like livestock. Some had laughed, a sharp, barking sound that pricked at her stillness. A child had thrown a stone that skittered past her feet. A man with a stained beard spat a brown stream of tobacco juice that landed just shy of her dress. But curiosity, like a fire fed on dry grass, burned hot and fast. Now they mostly ignored her. The sun beat down, turning the world to a shimmering haze, and she had become just another part of the miserable landscape. She felt him before she saw him. A change in the texture of the air, a shadow falling where there was none before. From the edge of the sparse crowd, a man watched. He was not part of the jeering or the judging. He stood with a stillness that mirrored her own, a figure carved from weathered wood and old grief. He wore a long, faded duster, the color of the dust itself, and his boots were scuffed and tired. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a landscape of loss she recognized instinctively. He did not look at her like an object of pity or scorn. He looked at her like a man looking at a fence post that had been struck by lightning, seeing not just the ruin, but the force of the blow that had caused it. Sterling appeared then, striding out of the saloon with the arrogant swagger of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He was clean where she was filthy, his suit dark and well-cut, his boots polished to a high sheen. He stopped before her, a contemptuous smile twisting his lips. He had promised her a new life, a home, a name. Instead, he had displayed her like a faulty piece of machinery, his investment gone sour. The journey had stripped away the meek compliance he had paid for, leaving something harder, something he could not bend to his will. "Well," Sterling announced to the lingering onlookers, his voice loud and performative. "It seems no one wants damaged goods. Time to cut my losses." He made to turn away, to leave her there for the coming night, a final act of casual cruelty. That was when the quiet man moved. He did not hurry. He simply detached himself from the shadows of the livery stable and walked into the unforgiving sunlight of the square. He stopped a few feet from Sterling, who looked him up and down with disdain. The man was thin as a fence rail, his face a roadmap of hard years. "I'll take her," the man said. His voice was low and raspy, like it came from under floorboards. It was not a plea or a bargain. It was a statement. Sterling let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You, Elias? What would you do with her? You can barely feed yourself." Elias said nothing. He simply reached into a pocket of his duster and pulled out a small, worn leather purse. He didn't open it. He just held it out. It was a gesture of transaction, simple and final. It spoke of settling a debt or perhaps just of ending the spectacle. Sterling's eyes glinted with a new kind of malice. To be rid of her and to humiliate the solemn widower in a single stroke was a temptation he couldn't resist. "Fine," he sneered, waving a dismissive hand. "She's your problem now. Consider my charity repaid." He did not take the purse. He turned on his heel and strode back into the saloon, the matter concluded in his mind. Elias stood there for a moment, the purse still in his hand. Then he let it drop back into his pocket. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. The few remaining townsfolk watched, their interest rekindled by this strange turn. He stopped in front of her, so close she could smell the scent of sage and clean earth on his clothes. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met hers for the first time. There was no pity in them, only a deep, weary understanding. He pulled a small, bone-handled knife from his belt. He didn't say a word. With a quiet, efficient motion, he sawed through the thick rope around her wrists. The fibers parted with a soft tearing sound. The rope fell away, leaving raw, red welts on her skin. She kept her hands where they were for a moment, pressed against the wood, her muscles forgetting how to be free. He stepped back immediately, giving her space. He did not offer a hand. He did not touch her. He simply waited, his patience as vast and empty as the plains around them. She slowly, stiffly lowered her arms. They felt impossibly heavy. Pins and needles shot through her fingers. She rubbed one wrist with the other, a small, unconscious gesture of self-comfort. Elias turned and walked toward a tired-looking horse hitched nearby. He untied the reins and began to lead it out of the town, heading east where the land opened up into a vast, unforgiving emptiness. He did not look back to see if she was following. He did not need to. The contract had been made. She hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then, placing one foot in front of the other, she followed him. Her shadow stretched out long and thin behind her, merging with his. The dust lifted from their passing like ghosts of the people they used to be, and the murmurs of the town faded until the only sounds were the plodding of the horse's hooves and the whisper of the wind. The journey was a long stretch of silence, measured in the shifting of the sun across the sky. He walked ahead, leading the horse, setting a pace that was steady but not punishing. He seemed to understand the weariness that had settled deep in her bones. For hours he did not speak or look back. The silence was not awkward, it was a space, a buffer between the life she had been torn from and whatever lay ahead. It was a place for the noise inside her head to settle. Late in the afternoon, when the sun beat down with a white-hot intensity, he stopped. Without a word, he unhooked a canteen from the saddle and held it out to her. His knuckles were cracked and scarred. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. The metal was warm from the sun. She drank deeply, the water tasting of metal and mercy. It was the first true kindness she had received in weeks, offered without expectation or price. She drank until her throat no longer burned, then handed it back. He took it and tied it to the saddle again before resuming his pace. They arrived as dusk was bleeding purple and bruised orange into the horizon. The homestead was small, almost lost in the vastness of the landscape. A cabin, a barn, and a few leaning fences were etched against the sky, looking as tired and weathered as the man who called them home. It was a place of profound isolation, miles from any road or neighbor. On a small, grassy rise a short distance from the cabin, a single wooden cross stood sentinel, its sharp lines softened by the fading light. His wife's grave. The knowledge settled in her not as a thought, but as a feeling. The whole place was haunted by an absence. He led the horse to the trough by the barn and gestured for her to go inside the cabin. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped over the threshold. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. It was starkly clean, almost painfully so. A single room held a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs and a narrow bed in one corner. There was an almost monastic simplicity to it, a space stripped of all but the most essential things. It was a reflection of the man himself. He entered a few moments later, carrying a bucket of water. He moved with a quiet economy, stoking the embers in the hearth and adding a few pieces of wood until a small fire crackled to life. He filled a pot with water and set it on a hook over the flames. Then he turned to her. He pointed to a small alcove she hadn't noticed, tucked away beside the hearth. A narrow cot was there, covered with a clean, patched blanket. It was her space. Separate. Safe. He looked at the main door, then back at her. "I don't lock doors," he said. His voice was still rough, but the words were a promise. He took a loaf of dark bread and a hunk of cheese from a cupboard, placing them on the table. He gestured for her to eat. He served himself and sat in one of the chairs, leaving the other for her. He ate slowly, his gaze fixed on the fire. He did not watch her. He did not ask her questions. He simply shared his food and his fire, establishing the unspoken rules of their new life. "You will have shelter. You will have food. You will not be a prisoner here." In the flickering firelight, surrounded by a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like sanctuary, she sat down and ate. The days fell into a rhythm, slow and deliberate as a heartbeat. Time was marked not by a clock, but by the sun's journey across the vast, empty sky and the chores that anchored them to the land. They worked in parallel, 2 solitary figures moving through a shared space. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would tend to his lone milking cow, its bell a dull, lonely clang in the morning stillness, and mend the endless stretches of fence that sagged under the weight of wind and time. She began tentatively. The first day, she did nothing but sit on her cot and watch. The second, she took the worn broom from the corner and swept the floor, the rhythmic scrape of bristles on wood a small, satisfying sound. The third, she found the chickens' hidden nests and gathered the eggs, her hands gentle on their fragile, warm shells. A silent language began to form between them, a grammar of completed tasks and anticipated needs. When he came in from the fields, he would find the water bucket full. When she woke, there would be a piece of wood added to the fire, taking the chill from the morning air. They rarely spoke. Words seemed too loud, too clumsy for the fragile piece they were building. Their communication was in the seeing. He saw the way she rubbed her bare feet at the end of the day, and one morning, a pair of sturdy leather boots appeared by her cot. They had belonged to his wife. They were too large, but she stuffed the toes with scraps of rag and wore them, the solid weight of them on her feet a strange comfort. She saw him stand on the rise at dusk, looking at the wooden cross, his shoulders slumped with a grief that time had not erased. The next afternoon, while gathering herbs, she found a stubborn, purple wildflower clinging to life in a rocky crevice. She picked it and, her heart hammering in her chest, placed it at the base of the grave marker. He never mentioned it, but that evening he repaired the broken handle on the water bucket she'd been struggling with. The small gestures stitched their lives together with raw thread. He noticed her hands red and chapped from the harsh lye soap. A small tin of greasy, pine-scented salve appeared on the kitchen table. She took his worn shirts, the elbows threadbare, and patched them with a neatness that spoke of long practice. One evening, as she sat mending by the fire, a tune surfaced from some deep, forgotten place within her. She began to hum, a quiet, broken melody. Elias, who had been sharpening his knife, went still. He did not look at her, but he stopped his work, listening until the tune faded back into silence. He tried to bake bread one day. The resulting loaf was a disaster, heavy and hard as a river stone. He set it on the table between them with a grimace. "That loaf died in vain," he muttered, the dry understatement so unexpected she almost smiled. She broke off a piece and chewed it with grim determination. The next day, using his flour and her memory, she tried. Her loaf was light with a crisp crust. She set it on the table. He ate 2 thick slices, his silence a more profound compliment than any words. After a moment, he looked at her effort, then at his own failed attempt still sitting on the counter. "Little dry," he said, gesturing to hers. She found her voice thin and reedy from disuse. "You didn't complain about mine." A flicker of something amusement maybe passed through his eyes. A storm blew in from the west one night, a sudden, violent squall that threw rain against the cabin like handfuls of gravel. The wind howled around the eaves, a mournful, angry sound that rattled the single window in its frame. The darkness in the cabin was absolute, broken only by fleeting, blue-white flashes of lightning. In the grip of the storm, a memory clawed its way out of her. The suffocating darkness, the jolting motion, the feeling of being trapped. A cry, small and strangled, escaped her lips. She heard him move immediately. Not toward her, but toward the hearth. The scrape of his chair, the soft thump of a log being placed on the embers. A moment later, the fire flared, pushing back the shadows, filling the small cabin with a warm, dancing light. He did not speak to her, did not ask what was wrong. He simply sat in his chair, a silent guardian, and kept watch. He stayed there until the storm passed and her trembling subsided, until the only sound was the steady crackle of the flames. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The air was cool and smelled of rain and wet earth. As she handed him a mug of chicory coffee, she spoke, the words costing her a visible effort. "He locked me in. On the wagon. A crate." Her voice was a mere whisper, thin as wet paper. Elias didn't flinch. He just took the mug, his fingers wrapping around its warmth. He met her gaze and gave a single, slow nod. He already knew. Or maybe he just knew that some hurts didn't need explaining. The confession, spoken aloud, did not shatter the quiet between them. It deepened it, turning it from a shared silence into a shared secret, a foundation built on the ruins of what came before. The peace was a fragile thing, a thin pane of glass against the outside world. It shattered one afternoon in a cloud of dust on the horizon. It started as a smudge, a distant disturbance that she watched from the porch, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The smudge grew, resolving itself into the shape of a horse and rider, moving with a purpose that felt like a threat. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. Elias came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw the rider and his body went rigid. He stood beside her on the porch, his presence a silent, solid wall. The rider was not Sterling. It was a man from the town, a weasel-faced man named Calloway who did errands for anyone with coin. He reined his horse in a few yards from the cabin, careful not to come too close. "Elias?" Calloway called out, his voice thin and reedy. He held up a folded piece of paper. A message. From Mr. Sterling. He didn't want to get any closer. He tossed the letter into the dust near the porch steps. Elias did not move to pick it up. He just stared at the man until Calloway grew nervous, fidgeting with his reins. "He's back," Calloway added, "says he's coming for his property." With that, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, eager to be gone. The letter lay in the dirt, a white scar on the red earth. After a long moment, Elias walked down the steps and picked it up. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the curt, arrogant script. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along the bone. He didn't need to read it aloud. She knew what it said. Sterling had come back. His pride, it seemed, was a more powerful motivator than his greed. His business venture in the next territory had likely failed, and he had returned to reclaim the one thing he felt he could control, the one person whose defiance had pricked his ego. 2 days later they came. 3 riders, black shapes against the bright morning sun. Sterling was in the lead, sitting tall in his saddle. He had brought 2 hired men with him, rough-looking men with hard eyes and gun belts slung low on their hips. They stopped where Calloway had, surveying the small homestead with open contempt. Sterling's gaze fell on her. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, her hands clutching the frame. She was not the bedraggled creature he had left tied to a post. Her hair was clean and braided, there was color in her cheeks, and she wore the sturdy boots Elias had given her. She looked settled, homed. The sight seemed to enrage him more than her previous state of wretchedness ever had. It was a testament to a life built without him, a life that flourished in his absence. "I've come for what's mine," Sterling shouted, his voice ringing with false authority. He directed his words at Elias, who had stepped out onto the porch. "I paid for her passage. I have the contract. The law is on my side. You stole my property, old man." Elias moved to the edge of the porch, planting his feet. He did not raise his voice. He stood between Sterling and the doorway, a quiet, immovable object. "She is not property," he said, and the words carried across the yard, clear and final as the tolling of a bell. "She stays here." Sterling let out a harsh, barking laugh. "And who will stop me? You? Your ghost of a wife." He nodded to his men, who began to swing their legs over their saddles, their hands resting near their pistols. They were preparing to take her by force. It was in that moment that something shifted inside her. The fear was there, a cold, familiar knot in her gut. But something else rose to meet it, a hot, fierce anger. An anger for the quiet man who had offered her sanctuary. An anger for the home they had begun to carve out of the wilderness. An anger for herself. She stepped out from the shadows of the doorway and onto the porch beside Elias. In her hands, she gripped the heavy, black cast-iron skillet from the stove. This weight was substantial, solid. Her knuckles were white, but her gaze did not waver. She fixed her eyes on Sterling, letting him see the defiance there. It was the first time in her life she had not tried to make herself smaller in the face of a threat. She was planting her own feet, claiming her own ground. Sterling stopped, his sneer faltering for a fraction of a second. He had expected tears, pleading, or the cowering he was used to. He had not expected this. He had not expected a woman holding a skillet like a shield, her eyes burning with a fire he did not recognize. Her movement changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. It was no longer just Elias standing against them. It was 2 people, a unified front defending their home. Sterling's hired men hesitated, their confident swagger vanishing. They had been paid to intimidate a broken woman and an old farmer, not to engage in a fight with 2 people who looked ready to die for the patch of dirt they stood on. "Get her," Sterling snarled at his men, his voice tight with frustration. But they didn't move. They looked from Elias's granite stillness to her unyielding glare, and they saw a fight that was more trouble than they were being paid for. Seeing his authority crumble, Sterling spurred his horse forward, intending to climb the porch steps himself. Elias didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply took one more step forward, his worn boots planting themselves firmly on the wood. His presence seemed to swell, filling the space, his quietness more menacing than any shouted threat. "You are not welcome here," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Leave." The simple command, delivered with such absolute finality, was the final blow. Sterling looked at Elias's unyielding face, at the woman who refused to be cowed, and at his own wavering men. His bluster was built on the assumption of easy victory. A real struggle, a fight he might lose in front of his men, was more than his fragile pride could withstand. With a venomous curse, he yanked on his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around so sharply it whinnied in protest. "She's not worth the trouble," he spat, a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. They were repelled not by violence but by the solid, unshakable wall of two people who had found something more valuable than property to protect. They stood on the porch, watching until the riders were nothing more than a faint plume of dust against the vast blue sky. The skillet felt impossibly heavy in her hands now, and she lowered it slowly, her arms trembling from the strain and the adrenaline. The silence that rushed back in was profound, broken only by the caw of a distant raven. Elias turned to her. His face was grim, but the storm in his eyes had passed. He didn't ask if she was all right, he could see that she was shaken. Instead, he did something he had never done before. He reached out and laid his hand on her shoulder. The touch was not invasive or proprietary. It was brief, firm, a gesture of solidarity and profound respect. The warmth of his hand soaked through the thin fabric of her shirt, anchoring her. "You were brave," he said, his voice rough. She looked up at him, at the deep lines etched around his eyes. The fear she had held back so tightly finally broke. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the film of dust on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "I was scared," she whispered, the words small in the great big quiet. "I know," he answered. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter. They sat at the table, sharing a meal, the silence between them no longer a space of caution but one of comfort. It was the quiet of a battle won, of a sanctuary defended. It was the quiet of a home. A few days later, they sat on the porch as the sun went down, painting the clouds in shades of apricot and rose. The threat had passed, but its shadow lingered. Elias finally broke the comfortable silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the riders had disappeared. "He might come back," he said, his voice low. "Or send the law. He has a piece of paper. He'll call it theft." He turned his calloused hands over in his lap, studying them as if he didn't know them. "A man can't steal what is freely given. And he can't claim what already belongs to another." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and full of a vulnerable gravity she had never seen in him before. "A man can't steal a wife." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a ring. It was a simple, thin band of gold, worn smooth with time. It was not a grand jewel, but it held the weight of generations. It was his mother's ring, then his wife's. He held it in the palm of his hand, a small, shining promise in the fading light. "This is not a demand," he said, the words catching in his throat. "It is a choice. Your choice." She looked from the ring, gleaming in his work-worn hand, to his face. She saw past the stoic protector to the lonely man beneath, a man who carried his own deep scars, a man offering her the only thing he had left to give, a name, a future, a place in his world. She saw the hope he tried so hard to conceal behind his weary eyes. Slowly, she held out her left hand. With a hand that trembled slightly, he took hers and slipped the ring onto her finger. It slid into place as if it had been made for her. It was a perfect fit. A warmth spread from it through her entire body. Elias cleared his throat, a rough, emotional sound. "I never asked," he said, looking away toward the hills. "I never knew your name." She looked out at the land that had become her refuge, at the quiet strength of the weathered barn and the sturdy fences. She felt the solid wood of the porch beneath her, the cool evening air on her skin, the solid gold band on her finger. She was no longer the nameless woman from the dusty square. She was here. She was home. "Lena," she said. The name felt strange and new on her own tongue, a word she was claiming for the first time. "My name is Lena." The next morning, Lena went to the small wooden trunk at the foot of her cot. From the very bottom, she pulled out the tattered, filthy remnants of the wedding dress she had arrived in. It was a symbol of all the humiliation, the pain, the person she had been forced to be. She carried it outside to the fire pit where they burned their trash. Elias came and stood beside her, understanding without needing to be told. He struck a match and held it to the frayed lace. The fabric caught, smoldering at first, then bursting into a bright, hungry flame. They stood together and watched the silk and lace curl and blacken, turning to ash. They watched as the wind took that ash, lifting it from the pit and scattering it across the land, letting it nourish the soil. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The seasons turned. A deep, quiet winter blanketed the ranch in snow, muffling the world in a peaceful silence. The cabin was a pocket of warmth and light against the cold. They spent the long evenings by the fire, mending harnesses and darning socks, the silence now rich with unspoken understanding. Spring arrived with a rush of green, thawing the earth and bringing the wildflowers back to the hills. Lena planted a small garden behind the cabin, her hands sinking into the rich soil. Elias built a new, stronger stall in the barn. Laughter, quiet and tentative at first, began to fill the spaces between the floorboards. The hollow places in the house and in themselves began to fill with life. Years passed, etching themselves into the land and into their faces. One late summer afternoon, Elias, his hair more silver than gray, sat on the porch step mending a leather strap. Lena sat in the rocker, her hands no longer just chapped but strong and capable, shelling peas into a metal bowl. A small boy with Elias's quiet eyes and her determined chin played in the dirt nearby, chasing a disgruntled chicken with shrieks of glee. The house no longer felt haunted by absence. It breathed. The sound of their child's laughter was its heartbeat. Lena looked from her son to her husband, and a slow, easy smile touched her lips. This was the life that had been waiting in the ashes. A life she had named and claimed and built with her own 2 hands. This story, it ain't just about a man saving a woman from a post. It's not about a rescue at all, not really. It's about how 2 people, broken by the world in different ways, can find the missing pieces of themselves in the quiet spaces they build together. It's about how the deepest wounds aren't healed by grand gestures but by the steady, patient application of small kindnesses. A cup of water. A shared loaf of bread. A fire lit against the dark. It's about the naming of things. He gave her a ring in a ranch, sure. But she gave herself a name. Lena. And in that naming, she claimed every part of her life that came after it. She defined her own worth. So here's your naming. Think on it. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can possibly do is answer, truly answer, when the world asks who you are. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to build a home in the ruins of a life, you might just find you're not building it alone. Because true rescue isn't about being pulled from the fire. It's about finding the person who is willing to sit with you in the ashes and see a garden.